So, Curtis and Anita, um, thanks for joining. So, there's some exciting news here. Let's kick it off this way. I think it's exciting. Curtis, you and I go way back. You've spent a lot of time guiding large corporations, Pearson, Cengage, Oracle, and now I hear you're launching a startup. And as someone that's focused on this challenge, which I'll try and in a nutshell say it's scaling effective post-secondary learning. And you've focused on that for a long time across all the business aspects of it: strategy, integration, business development, product delivery. So should I infer that from the startup that we may be at a kind of inflection point here? And if so, what is that?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Matt, for having us on. And I'll introduce Anita quickly. Anita's part of the Argos team, and you'll hear more from her. Yeah, so crazy enough, we hit this pandemic, and I get reconnected to Michael Feldstein, who's part of our team at Oracle, and many of you may know the eLiterate blog. And Michael and I latched on to realizing kind of really the thrust of the pandemic, the really tectonic kind of shift we were going to see, particularly in technology-enabled teaching and learning. And so we've been working on this startup for about 6 months now, and this audience is actually about the first group to hear the name, which is Argos Education. If you look at the Quiller, you'll see the slide I put up there that really talks about this inflection point that Mark is asking about, which has been brewing for a while. And I borrowed the theme of punctuated equilibrium from an HBR article that was about a year ago. It was prescient in the sense that, yeah, this pandemic is going to change a lot of things. But if you look at the arc, this is the biggest set of changes since the rise of the internet in the 90s. And the flow of things, we've introduced technology specifically for teaching and learning, but it's amounted in my frame as really supporting administrative efficiency, right? It's not helping a course run better necessarily. It's helping courses have a digital presence. It's helping students with access and availability and things like that. And we saw the rise also, Karin, apologies, but adaptive systems. We've seen a rise of other technologies that really had, big ideas and goals, but few have met, kind of the scale impact. And so Argos is really going after the idea that the publisher textbook space has really been ripening for disintermediation, and we're going to try to finish the job. We're going to take a different swing at it. It's not an enterprise license platform, but it is a platform. And for those of you who know Canva.com, I often say with VCs who are not ed tech savvy, I'll say it's Canva.com meets learning science. It's a pedagogical workflow to develop digital first courses, not strictly digital. It can be supportive of multiple modalities and multiple different technologies to be brought to bear on the learning experience. But it's meant to bring a coherent design to that. And the rationale, and it goes back to this inflection, universities have to think differently about brand protection and what their digital identity is. They have to think differently about the kinds of modalities and the kinds of learner audiences they can capture. Where's their market? I just came off another session earlier today from the Web Study Foundation, right? All the rules are changing in terms of what describes a college student, what a degree should look like, things like that. And listening to the other sessions earlier today, when you think about all the topics we're thinking about in terms of persistence and completion rates, or whether our faculty were ready for the onslaught of digital first, teaching, whether students were, what the issues are around access and affordability. And, the publishers in particular for the last decade have been battling this inversion of their value to price prospects, right? So it's many things, Mark, and at the ripe age that I am, that I won't say out loud, decided what better time to take the plunge, become an entrepreneur, and stay tuned. Argos will be launching, we hope, around June 1st. So you'll hear about our first customers and what our plans are.
Well,
wow.
Congrats.
Excellent. So I mean, it's part of the way I digest this is as we're also getting at a point where we can, and some of the things that Lou and Curran brought up, but applied to learning. So we're at a point where we can start predicting learning efficacy at the individual level, so that the individual versus the cohort in all the various dimensions of that. So if that's true, and you are handed a profile that is potentially updated, you have more insight around the learner, whatever kind of learner they are, how do you envision applying it to their learning your product and then track that outcome?
Yeah, so wow, a learner profile, that's a complex and fraught subject, and there's no better time than now to really introduce Anita. Actually has a PhD in this stuff. So Anita, introduce yourself and tell us what you're doing with Argos.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Matt, for having us. I couldn't have enjoyed the session with Karan and Lou any better than I did, because I think they touched on some of these themes so beautifully. And I want to apply a lot of what they're saying to their support and analytics frameworks to the learning environment as well. And I think it transfers very nicely. Learner profile, that's a challenging term for all the reasons they brought up. That might imply that we're using predictive analytics or big data to sort of put people into categories that necessarily flatten the richness of who they are as a learner. And so that's my only hesitancy with that term learner profile. I'm not sure that's exactly the way you mean it here. So really what we want, though, is to have as much rich data about any individual learner developed, sort of presented real time to the instructor. I mean, educators are no different than we are. They are preparing for what they need to do tomorrow and later that day at the same time that we're preparing for our activities. They need real-time data. They need to understand what students are doing, what they're not doing, how much time they're spending, how they are interacting with the materials, what their misconceptions would be, what type of misconceptions have already tried to be remedied and how that worked or didn't work. And one of the things I like to say is the LMS, and this is another theme we could take probably from every session I've heard today. The LMS is necessary but not sufficient. And I think what we've started to see is the development of courseware platforms that are beginning to provide some of this information. There are some challenges with the existing courseware platforms that exist. First of all, they're not sort of open standards based. They're very black box. So that was another theme I heard in the conversation, the last conversation. They don't really support ingress and egress of analytics in a way that supports broader applications than what might be designed in that platform. And I'd say one of the largest deficits of the current courseware platforms is they're really focused on adapting the curriculum, for example, the resources, the number, the quality, the type, the when, the where. They have done a lot less work, almost really no work in terms of allowing the educator to be flexible, him or herself, in terms of the pedagogy that they present. So I think, there's this idea that, the ideal of education is one tutor and one student, and we want to, sort of replicate that in the digital environment. I would argue that there's never been a tutor who only brings one pedagogical approach to the table. And in each of the courseware platforms that I've, sort of had the chance to use or evaluate, you find that kind of one method of pedagogy, one model of pedagogy that gets perpetrated sort of throughout the system, and in some ways constrains the pedagogical models that the instructor can apply.
Okay, so that's interesting. I guess a big through line today is around data and constituent engagement. You're right. When I use learner profile, I guess I think of it in the generic term as something that actually needs focus for a variety of reasons. And I've got some interesting feedback from all kinds of different players and what it would mean and how it might be used. But I guess if I put those two things together, data and constituent engagement in service of what we're ultimately here for, and that is to provide learning or support people that are on that journey, how do you sustain relevance and innovation. In this case, I guess, when thinking about Argos, and as Curtis referred to it, at least in one of our communications, about a learning experience platform, which I think is right smack where we need to be in this discussion. So, but what is that, and how would you contrast either what you're building or what is needed, I suppose, against what's available today with LMS and other aspects of the teaching and learning infrastructure?
Yeah, so at the, what Anita and I have been talking about, at the core of it is a couple of key notions. One is this idea of the plasticity of teaching and learning and quality, right? There's a lot of rigidity in the existing platforms today. And one of the challenges with the data exhaust is the systems all speak different data languages, and normalizing, particularly for learning analytics, student engagement kinds of analytics, it's pick your reference. It's the Tower of Babel. There's 1,000 different languages, and normalizing it to make sense of it is difficult. And you're not going to get, I love the reference to vaccines. You're not going to get to a consistently efficacious viewpoint until we create that semantic. And that's part of what we're all about. The way our system works. And by the way, I appreciated Karen's description of, kind of the traditional startup MVP, et cetera. The technologies we're leveraging already have hundreds of thousands of learners enrolled on it. Anita's actually been involved from a research angle. And so a lot of what we're doing is setting up now for high, very large scale, research-oriented, evidence-based gains in the system to drive the advancement, particularly of the teaching side of the equation. That learner and that learner profile will become more, richly informed and robust as we gain kind of momentum in that. Mark, you've heard me say it before. When Michael talks about this, he refers to the arc of the evolution of medicine, and particularly treating different kinds of diagnoses, from kind of snake oil salesman to where we are with the mRNA vaccines. Think about it in that kind of context. I don't know, Anita, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly right. I think the current, as you're saying, the current offerings, they don't have the opportunity for the flexible pedagogical models, meaningful and transferable data that can have real-time impact in teaching, the data interoperability. But we're also, beyond that, we're also envisioning the way in which analytics can support authoring. So, we often have this notion that analytics really supports course iteration and improvement over time. I'm as interested in the first cohort of learners as I am in the second, third, fourth, or fifth cohort of learners. I always think, who are these poor people who have to have the first version of this course, that doesn't have any sort of support in terms of analytics. And what we'd like to do in building out an ecosystem and a marketplace for curricular materials is to pull in analytics that are, sort of speaking to, I want to build a course. I want to make sure it's the right amount of content. First of all, a lot of people who've sort of purchased off-the-shelf offerings, whether they're publisher or courseware, soon recognize that they have a mass of content that they have to offer the whole thing. They can't really right size it. They can't make it modular. They can't really adapt it easily for their needs without starting from scratch. I either take it as it is or I build it. And there's really nothing in between. So part of what we're envisioning is the ability to use pieces, sort of learning objects that have a learning objective, an attached piece of content, practice and assessment activities, but then not only to expose analytics related to that modular piece of content, allow folks to author based upon that pre-existing modular piece of content. And back to what I was saying, sort of give them analytics about, this should take your students about 20 minutes. Have you considered using this second set of learning objectives and materials after this one? Because we have data that says this is actually a really effective pathway for a lot of students. So maybe that's a little bit of your learner profile idea there, but to really bring those analytics into the authoring, into the experience of the learning and the teaching, and to keep that cycle going.
Okay, well, yeah, that's interesting. And so let's bring it back into more immediate context. What has COVID meant to your efforts and your thinking, given that institutions are more or less forced to embrace the LMS in ways they hadn't in the past. And so my impression also is that forced a lot of them to understand some of the limitations in the LMS from a learning experience standpoint. And now you see, large technology companies. Microsoft made a couple of interesting announcements last week in their online conference about where they were headed and how they're thinking about things, all in the service of learning. So, what is, is there a transition thing here? I mean, as you think about what you're building or developing, or where the industry is going to go to a new thing, or is there a coexistence? Can you sort of place these in the road ahead, even things you're just thinking about?
Sure. Yeah, and going back to my point about punctuated equilibrium, I mean, one of the advantages we have, and whether it's Microsoft and Google making the changes to their systems they have, or whether it's the advancement of new engagement platforms, I guess I could name names: Engagely, Class Tech, kind of Zoom-like capabilities. It's in direct response to, holy shit, we now had to do everything online. We had no idea really how to do that at the appropriate scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a lot of band-aids that that showed up on the landscape. I guess the relative to the LMS, one thing I'd point out, and I've got lots of friends in the LMS space, maybe some of them are here, so problems in advance, but how long did it take for any one LMS vendor to get to kind of more than 40% of course penetration by their faculty, right? It took more than a decade, right? So it wasn't a no-brainer. It was often, the early days was often a CTO driven decision for the enterprise. And it was a backup plan. It's like, this is how we're going to create access points for our learners. Again, the value prop was there, but it was oriented not to pedagogy, not to outcomes, not to, these other topics. And so the pandemic just reiterated that, and it had to us the advantage of it forced everybody to go try. When you had a bunch of very reluctant, teachers in the environment, and I've had literally dozens and hundreds of conversations with educators over the last 9 months who would start by saying, I hated technology. I was either didn't see the point of it, I was afraid to take my job, I was scared to use it, and suddenly they're like, wow, I'm actually getting affordances I did not have in my traditional didactic model. Why? Because technology tends to leave data trails, right? It's giving me insights. It's giving me models of communication that I didn't have at my disposal before. So, that's the big shift. We are not out to replace the LMS. We just think the LMS has a very specific, role in the ecosystem as it's currently constructed. We're building a different kind of layer. We're building a different kind of approach to the model. Anita, began to mention kind of the crowdsourcing. So we're applying to that authoring experience all the wisdom that's being generated by the creator users. And that, one of the things that's true about the course design and redesign cycle, whether you're an individual instructor or whether in building your own thing, or whether you are using a Pearson MyLab product, you typically build it and you let it sit for 5 years. And so there's no A/B testing, there's no agility, there's no advancing the ball. And that's, to us, that's one of the bigger pain points and one of the barriers to us actually making all of this better.
Okay, interesting. Well, we've got a couple of folks that
see questions.
are queued there. I think Rodney, you were first.
Thanks, Mark. As a former faculty member, my doctoral program did not teach me to teach. It didn't teach me to design a course. It didn't teach me to design a curriculum. And it certainly didn't teach me to manage a graduate program or an undergraduate program. When you start talking about student or learner profiles and integrating that into the decision-making from week to week in a course as a result, it seems to me that the faculty are missing in their training a lot of what will be needed to take advantage of this to the maximum extent possible. So, and this is a long-term impact. We're going to have to change a lot of systems to bring this about. Could you address that a little bit and what your thinking is as you all go forward?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Anita's really the scientist here on this one, and a practitioner, frankly. But this is where I love the reference to the medical analogy, right? Because in a sense, and particularly in post-secondary, there's a reason, and Anita will touch on this, I'm sure, there's a reason why K-12 teaching and corporate L&D teaching is kind of a very different landscape right now in terms of the evolution of the practice, right? But I love this analogy of medicine because it's akin to the country doctor pre-Civil War US, who was kind of making it up based on what they knew and whatever, to the country doctor today who knows there's a body of research out there that they lean to continue their service to their patients. And so we need to move the industry, the sector broadly along on this and think about the incentives that institutions, the culture, the incentives, the models they have for the way we go about preparing educators, to do this. And agreeing that there's value in driving that advancement. So, Anita.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up K-12, and so I'm thinking about that for a moment. I think K-12 in some ways is much more advanced than higher ed in their ability to track individual students, what's happening with them, very real time, and respond, whether it's create small groups, pull up additional resources, whatever the response is. I think higher ed often still thinks of a course as an entire cohort and what I have to do for the cohort, and part of that is a time constraint. Part of that is faculty have more than one job in all cases, whether that's research or not, they always have more than one job. So I think, part of what's the onus is on us to make sure that the analytics that are provided are human readable, make sense, answer real kind of questions that an instructor might have. Many people are familiar with the flipped teaching model where, I want to know what was happening Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday so that I can make decisions about what I'm going to do in my class on Wednesday. The other thing that I'm thinking about in response to your question, and also going back a little bit to Mark's question about COVID, I think what's so interesting about the last year is that institutions have learned that flexibility is not quite as hard as many of them thought it was once they were forced to do it. So, I think we saw tremendous movement in terms of instructor availability, recognizing that they needed to be available to their students who never made it back from China in very different ways. We saw tremendous advances in terms of student support, counseling, advising. So I think we need to keep that momentum going post-COVID or next phase of COVID that we're transitioning into here. One institution that I know, after they got through the crush of the spring, faculty were still exhausted. And so the approach over the summer heading into the fall was, let's take the +1 model for 99% of our classes. What did we do? What worked? Can we add one thing to make the overall course experience better based upon our learnings? So I think there's just a tremendous opportunity to keep that trajectory going and to bring in new tools, new data, better readable data and more real time, answering the questions that instructors really have about their students to let them make decisions both at the cohort level, the individual level, and the group level.
Thank you.
Great. Carla.
Hi, I really appreciate this conversation. A couple of thoughts went through my head, and I'm the registrar at the University of Minnesota Duluth. And Mark, you might remember from.
I do, yeah. Good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. So, one of the things that we have been talking about for a very long time is, it gets to this heart of the conversation, is in higher education, we are some of the worst teachers of our own people. We talk about being student-centered, but it really is about being people-centered. When was the last time you really found an investment in our organization, in not only just the faculty, but the staff who are doing teaching and learning in and outside of the classroom? the holistic of, in order to help people get there and adopt to the digital, adopt to the new LMS, adopt to the new data and how to use data, is coaching and helping people and reinvesting in our people. In a couple of earlier sessions, we talked about data and having a data therapist. You know, my experience through being in a couple of Big 10 schools, an online big enterprise system project is probably the best thing that I was a teacher first, and I helped faculty be their coach to change, right? And I didn't approach it from an IT world, which we often do in LMS. We throw our IT specialists in there who are really confident, which then our faculty and our other staff run the other direction, right? Because they're worried about not appearing as the expert. But when we get into it, that we are all lifelong learners, and here's how you're going to invest, and here's how you come into it. I think we can do and approach the things here that we're talking about, and I think this company is going to be very successful. When we remember there is an 80-20 rule, and my 80-20 rule is like this. As adult learners, and this is where my training is that you will have 10% of the people, no matter what your age group, that will just get it, right? They'll just get it. It makes sense. They adopt to things very quickly. You might have 10% of the people who will always ask for help. Why? Because it's really not that they need help, is they value that teaching, learning conversation. And they might want it over and over again because that's what they need as a human, going back to some other people. So the question in front of all of us, and I think I'm interested in knowing what leadership, chancellors, presidents are saying, is where are you investing in the 80% of your people resources? Data is not our largest and most important asset. Our people are. And where are we investing there to help bridge people to get into there safely into new data sets in the data lake, new LMS systems that don't sit on the sidelines for 5 years? That's hugely expensive. But I think that is a piece that I've seen missing from conversation, is the investment that needs to go along with the IT investment. Thanks for letting me chat for a little bit.
Curtis, do you want to take a stab, and then I have some thoughts too?
I'll start. And frankly, Carla, thank you. I mean, what you're getting into probably Matt should run a whole session just on that, right? This is really what we're talking about in my view. And again, I've been in this industry, universities, enterprise software, learning software for 30 plus years, right? So there, I dated myself. So I've seen a lot, and you know, the way I would say is, you know, the academy had certain rules and cultures, and part of, I think, what's going on with this inflection it's been brewing for some time, and there's been different, you know, the introduction of the for-profits, and now the move towards skills credentialing and some other things. It's redefining, you know, all the traditional rules of the academy. Remember, the academy was principally, you know, built to do what? To create typically learned gentlemen, frankly, right? Back in the day. And we've moved way beyond that, fortunately, but to many of the conversation around equity and access, et cetera, you know, these are the critical features on that matter today, that matter for, I hope, all of us on this call anyway, from a societal point of view, from an economic development point of view, et cetera. And so, you know, the short answer is it's got to be about culture, and it's got to be a reconciliation of the mission of the academic institution with respect to what their actual business model is. And it was interesting. Is it Kelly Doyne, Matt, who was on earlier from Villanova?
Kelly Doyne, yeah.
You know, she was talking about her provost calling his or her, I forget it was a man or a woman, but his or her constituents customers. Like, that was heresy just a few years ago, if you called your students customers, right? Yeah. So I think if we, you know, this is, to me, the key part is you move your institution toward the student or customer-centric model, and a lot of things begin to change around the attitude with which, you know, your administrator, your faculty take with respect to what their day jobs are, right? And we move beyond this framing, well, the students are lucky to come get us, to come to our school. You know, we live in this world of scarcity, to we're here to get a job done, and we're here to make this individual's life better. and that should be, you know, #1 goal every day. And that will lead to this decisions where I think you're headed, Carla, with your question, which is how do we do a better job preparing our people to be ready to meet the learner where they are every day? You don't, you know, I'm borrowing ahead a little bit, Mark. I'm not sure we'll get there anyway, but this idea of learner customer journey, like student learner journey, you better protect your brand. Disney doesn't let that go to waste. Why should University of Minnesota? Right? Protect your brand at every touch point. I think a lot of the conversations today have leaned right into that.
So Curtis, the one thing that I would ask is that brand discussion has to be revisited by many, right? Because a lot of their brand is dictated by where they are in the U.S. news reports. Yep. It's dictated by, you know, where their peers rank them or the research that they're doing. And yet students, like my daughter, I mean, she's, you know, picking a good school, didn't pick a school based on any ranking. She picked a school that sent her a shirt, that invited her to a couple Zooms, introduced her to some students, they sent her some cookies. They in the tour, they talked academics, and it was a student who talked academics to her. And the school, she had 2 choices. And she said, I'm going to this school because the student who did the tour with me told me about the academics that she is going through, how she got into a program, an internship. And she also knows the why of that school, right? They have a community, they had the why clearly defined. I'm not trying to sell the school. I'm trying to tell you how, I'll be honest, we have a stack of materials, and we run a branding and marketing company here. That's what we do at Beyond too. And we look at it and it's about them. It's not about the student. And that's the brand that we have to recognize. What are you as a brand going to represent my daughter or someone else's kid as you move forward? That needs to be really thoughtfully articulated more today than ever before.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
And Matt, just I was going to say, wouldn't it be wonderful sort of if part of that brand was the quality of the teaching? So, you know, we invest a lot in supporting administrators. We invest a lot in supporting students. We, you know, to Carla's point, and I think the point of the question before that, we don't always invest a lot in supporting teachers. And yet teachers really, by and large, make up a large part of the experience that students have. And so we have an opportunity to, you know, allow teachers to better train teachers, provide materials for teachers, create templates that support them in their professional development as educators, that I think we're just missing that whole part of the pie.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Like, we probably can have these sidebar Zooms on a Friday, and maybe that's what we'll do is just, hey, join us. We're going to talk about this topic because I think it's so deep, right? I know, Mark, we probably are at the 30-minute mark, so we'll probably have to.
Yep, and it's a good transition, I think, because the broader topic of engagement, brand management, is something that I think higher education is grappling with, understanding that they need to compete a different way, and that's only going to get more intense in the coming years. And so what do you do? And I think the idea that there can be higher ed specific providers of these platforms and these products, it will put the industry at a tremendous disadvantage when there are state-of-the-art commercial platforms with all the R&D that goes along with that are starting to tailor their platform for the education space. And leveraging that as a community is, if higher ed doesn't do that, I think it's just a tremendous opportunity lost, and potentially higher ed deserves where they end up.